So today, we're going to dive into the methods that literally built the foundation of modern language teaching. We're talking about the traditional, rule-focused world that came way before the communicative classrooms that many of us know today.
If you've ever been in a language class that felt more like a math class, just full of formulas and memorizations, well, you've pretty much experienced the legacy of these traditional methods firsthand. So let's unpack exactly why they were designed that way.
All right, here's the game plan for this explainer. We'll kick things off with the whole grammar first idea. Then we'll look at the classic method, grammar translation. After that, we'll see how things evolved, unpack the learning theories behind it all, and finally, check out the influence they still have today.
Okay, so let's start with the big overarching idea that ties all these methods together, the form-focused approach. And believe me, this was the main way of thinking about language learning for a very, very long time.
The core philosophy here is actually pretty simple. Language is basically a code, and you have to learn the rules of that code, the grammar, the syntax, all of it, before you can even think about using it to communicate. It was all about structure first, conversation second, and sometimes conversation never really came at all.
And this way of thinking led to some very specific things in the classroom. The focus was always on the nuts and bolts, grammar, vocab lists, sentence structure. The teacher was the expert, the one with all the answers, and getting every single sentence perfectly correct, what we call accuracy, was way, way more important than just getting your message across, which is what we now call fluency. All right, let's get into the most famous, or maybe I should say infamous, of all these methods, the grammar translation method, or GTM for short. I mean, this is the original blueprint, the one that really set the stage for everything that followed.
GTM really boiled down to two main activities. First, the teacher stands at the front of the room and just explains a grammar rule, point blank. And second, the students spend most of their time just translating written texts word for word from the language they're learning into their own and then back again.
So you can see this created a really clear power dynamic. The teacher was the authority, the absolute source of all knowledge. The learner's job? It wasn't to create or to communicate. It was to sit there, passively receive information, memorize it, and repeat it back. Actually speaking the language, that was barely even on the radar. But of course, things didn't just stand still. Over time, educators started to tweak the formula a little, and some new approaches started to pop up, moving out of the shadow of GTM.
One of the first was the reading approach, and this was super practical. The goal here wasn't to have a conversation. It was to give academics and professionals the skill to read scholarly articles or books in another language. So grammar was only taught when you absolutely needed it to understand what you were reading.
And then came an even bigger shift, the situational approach. Now, for the first time, the focus actually moved towards spoken language. But, and this is a big but, it was still all about getting the form and the accuracy perfect. This was not about having a free-flowing, spontaneous chat. So language was taught in these really controlled, predictable scenarios or situations. The teacher would model sentence patterns like, I would like to buy, or where is the, and the students would just drill those patterns over and over and over again through repetition until they were flawless. The goal wasn't free expression, it was perfect pattern usage. Okay, so to really get what's going on here, we have to kind of pop the hood and look at the learning theories that were powering these methods. And this brings us to a really crucial distinction, deductive versus inductive teaching. The traditional methods we've been talking about? They almost all use the deductive approach. The process is always rule first. The teacher gives you the formula, right? Like, okay, here's how you form the past tense. And then the students just practice applying that exact formula in exercises. Simple as that. Now, the inductive approach completely flips the script. Here, students see the language in action first, maybe in a story or a conversation. And their job is to be a kind of language detective, to look at all the evidence and figure out the pattern or the rule for themselves, with the teacher acting more like a guide. And this, right here, highlights the fundamental difference. Deductive is rule first, which turns the learner into a passive applicator of rules. Inductive is examples first, which makes the learner an active discoverer. Honestly, this evolution from just applying rules to actively discovering them is one of the biggest, most revolutionary shifts in the history of language education. It's exactly why traditional methods love deduction and why modern teaching leans so heavily on induction. So, after all of this, what's the verdict? Are these old methods just dusty relics of history? Not even close. Let's wrap up by looking at the powerful and pretty lasting legacy they've left on classrooms even today.
You know, it's easy to look back and criticize these old methods for what they were missing, which was, actual communication. But they weren't necessarily wrong. They were just a product of their time, and they laid the critical groundwork that everything else has been built on.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, these methods gave us a deep respect for structure and accuracy. They established a clear role for the teacher. And you know what? Some of their techniques, like a quick, explicit grammar explanation when things get tricky, are still incredibly useful. They provide a valuable toolkit that we can blend with modern communicative practices. And that really is the key, isn't it? The best teaching today doesn't just throw out the past. It understands the strengths of these foundational methods and uses them strategically as a tool to help build something even better, confident and effective communicators. Thanks so much for joining me.